This interview is part of the Living Legends collection of the Oklahoma Historical Society. It is an interview with Mr. John M. Young, interviewed by Mr. Pendleton Woods. There's no date and no location on the interview. It is being copied for inclusion in the permanent collection of the Oral History Program on April 16, 1990 by Joel Todd.
We're visiting with Mr. John Young, and he's talking about the opening of the Cherokee Strip.
Well, you want me to go back?
Just back where you started.
My family moved to Oklahoma, Kingfisher, Oklahoma, in January of 1891, and the Cherokee Strip was to be open on the 16th day of September, 1903. So even at that time, everybody was excited about this new country that was going to be open, and also the whole thing behind everybody's thinking was the eventual thing of getting statehood, and they were very much enthused over it. So we trained 2 horses for long distance running, and on the date when the Cherokee Strip was going to be open, John McCartney, a close friend of mine, and I rode 2 horses, and when the soldiers fired the gun, we went across the line, and there was every kind of conveyance of covered wagons, surreys, and so on and so forth. But of course, at that time, I had no automobiles. And as we progressed toward Enid, which was 22 miles away, we found plenty of horses in there that showed that they had not made the run from Hennessy. Those were Sooners and caused a tremendous amount of trouble. My idea was to get a claim about 3 miles east of Enid, because I'd heard that was a beautiful land. And we got up there, and I got the claim all right. And in the next 2 or 3 weeks, I built a sod house on the farm, because you had to show improvements to show that somebody had staked that particular claim. But I like 3.5 months of being 21 years of age. But under law, I had 6 months to file. So I was waiting my time so I could file. And a friend of mine, supposed friend of mine at Kingfisher, knew my age. And after the run in the Cherokee Strip, thousands of people came in there to buy claims. They didn't want to make the run, but they knew that plenty of people would go in there and take these claims that did not intend to hold them. So this man by the name of Henry Whittemire went to this particular agent, and this fella told him for a nice fee that he knew a claim that he could file over, but never, of course, mentioned the fact that some young fella had a claim to it. And but anyway, he filed on my claim, and I lost it. But I got even with that guy 4 years later, because I married his daughter.
Did he disown her after that?
Huh?
Did he disown her after that?
No. No, we became good friends. He was really not to blame, because he didn't know anything about me, or my claim to fellow didn't tell him that. And so I was a little fatigued, and I went into Enid to get something to eat at about 6 o'clock, and the restaurants were there in tents, and some of them out in the open. And I sat down and ordered something to eat and a cup of coffee. And as I stirred my coffee, I felt a little drag on the spoon. And finally I found out that there was some strings of moss in it. And I called the waiter over, and I told him, I said, listen, I said, this coffee's got moss in it. And he said, well, he said, I'll tell you. He said, we brought down a lot of water, but said we have used it all, and we had to just dip down an old boggy creek. And of course, he said, there's a lot of moss in it. But he said, you can rest assured there'll be no extra charge for the moss. So there were a couple of young guys there that brought in 4 chick sails, and they hurriedly built a barbed wire fence around it and a gate, and they charged 10 cents for admission. And they did a thriving business. You could always see a crowd standing at the gate. And the railroads, the Rock Island had come in there with a lot of building materials and different and foods and all that sort of thing. And you could hear the hammers and the saws, and people were already building houses and barns and business houses. And it was very active there, and everybody seemed to be in good spirits because anybody could take 2 lots, and it didn't cost them anything. My father and mother didn't get in till the next day, but they finally bought a couple of lots from somebody that had staked them before. And the end of that week, they were wanting to organize a church. So with some friends, they went to a fellow by the name of Jim Usler, who had a nice saloon in a tent. And they arranged with him so that they could have the use of his saloon on Sunday. And Jim, he shined up the spittoons, and he put new sawdust on the floors and had tables in there. And the First Presbyterian Church of Enid, Oklahoma was organized there, and is now one of the finest edifices in the whole edifices, the whole state of Oklahoma. And it was my pleasure when they built this new church, which was the 3rd one on the same spot, and they had called me at Miami, Florida, and asked me if I would give a memorial window to the Young family. And I said, there's a lot of memorial windows in a big church like that, and I've got a different idea. I said, if you've got a center aisle, I would like to give them a communion table. They wrote me back and said, at the time they wrote me, they didn't have a center aisle, but they do have one now. And so I contacted Anton Lang at Amaromagau, Germany, and had him make a carving in light oak of the Last Supper. And it took about 8 months before I got the thing shipped over here to the United States and sent it to a church furniture store, manufacturing plant, and had set in a black walnut table. And it is now a very beautiful thing in that church in Enid, Oklahoma. And cut it off. As I said before, I married this beautiful girl, and the way I met her was that I was going in the courthouse one day, and I saw a sweet-looking girl with a tam o' shanter cap on, and the wind was blowing the tassel, and she was going from the west side of the public square over to the east side. So I changed my idea, because I just happened to think I had that errand to do over on the east side. So at a decent distance behind her, I went over to the east side, and she went into B.F. Thompson's 5 and 10 cent store. And I'd been in there before because they sold some office supplies there. And so I went in, and lo and behold, this young lady was in charge of that part of the store. And I bought a few lead pencils and probably a bottle of ink and so on and so forth. But for some reason or other, those lead pencils whittled away awful fast, because I found occasion to go into that store quite often to buy different things. And after some weeks, I introduced myself, and we got to be so we could talk. And I asked her for a date and suggested that we take a hayride with the Clampett children, young people, and she accepted. It wasn't too long until we were going steady, and then finally we got married, and we had 2 children. And the daughter is, at the present time, keeping house for me in Miami, Florida, and my son went from Harvard Graduate School into J.P. Morgan's bank. And when Congress separated commercial from investment banking, J.P. Morgan went commercial, and 6 of the Morgan people, including my son, started Morgan Stanley and Company. And now this company has progressed to the place where they have 38 partners. And last year, they did over $7 billion worth of business. They also have companies in London, Paris, Rome, and Brussels. So my children have really been a pleasure all their life and never given me any trouble, except this young man at one time in Lawton, Oklahoma. We had a sports arena built out in the backyard, screened in, and we had a pair of boxing gloves, and we were trying each other out, and I saw a right-hander coming at me, and I tried to dodge it, but he hit me right on my head and almost drove it back through my shoulders. Anyway, I had to go for 6 months to an orthopedic surgeon to get it straightened up. But otherwise that. But at that time, I was big dog, and he was pup. But I don't know, in later years, I guess, when he come to his accountability, and he knew me pretty well. Now, every time he writes me a letter, every time he addresses me, it's Dear Rep. That's reprobate, if you want to know. And but he's still pup for me.
And your son and daughter were both here to share with you the honor that you received last night.
And my son is a member of the Ambassadors Club here in Oklahoma.
You, in our conversation, you told me an item, but when we were not on tape, about the Constitutional Convention and its funding, or lack of funding, whichever you want to call it, and the governor, Bill Murray's participation in helping to keep it funded and keeping it going. Why don't you tell about that?
When Congress passed the Enabling Act, they provided $100,000 for the expense of the Constitutional Convention, which was wholly inadequate. Our clerks and stenographers and pages, and all the employees drew very low daily salaries. Today, they probably draw 10 times as much. And it got so after about the middle of the convention that we were really out of money. And Bill Murray went down to Tishomingo, and he borrowed $4,000 on his own note, and he kept that note going until the interest had equaled the principal. Then he made a public appeal to the people to help defray the expenses of the convention, but he only got $2,100 from that source. Then Bill called some of the leaders together, and they decided that we could dispense with about half of our force. That was done, and he discharged every employee that was just not absolutely necessary to the finishing of the convention.
You told me also about when Governor Murray later ran for president, when he came down to Miami.
Oh, you want me to say that? Well, Bill at one time ran for president. I don't know whether he had announced publicly or not, or whether he was just feeling his way. But I was living in Miami, and I got a telegram that Bill would be there on a certain day to make a speech, and asked me to make the arrangement. I went to the city and got the city park, which is located on Biscayne Boulevard, right in the heart of the business center, and on Biscayne Bay, and arranged for the speaking. When Bill arrived, he had a very troublesome ulcered tooth, and is badly swollen, and I insisted on him having it pulled, but he didn't want to do that. He said it would go away and be all right eventually, but it was in terrible situation, so I took him to a dentist, and the dentist probably finally got him to let him pull the tooth. And I had arranged with a very beautiful woman who was active in politics to introduce Bill. And we had a tremendous crowd, at the meeting because the papers had advertised who he was and what he had done and all that sort of thing. So when the time came for Bill to speak, he said, I will have to sit down to deliver my address. And Bill had a big black hat on, and he had what he called a newbie, something that was put around his neck. And so he sat down and delivered this talk. The talk was really thrilling, and everybody was very much interested because I think Bill Murray showed that he had such a great knowledge of the law, not only in the United States, but in foreign countries as well. And of course, this tooth was bothering him, and every once in a while, Bill would have to expectorate, and he would just reach out with his right foot, and he would settle it down, and keep on with his talk. Well, I was terribly afraid that maybe it would create a bad impression, but it evidently didn't, because the newspapers the next day came out with the most thrilling stories about Bill Murray and his speech, and he was credited with being a real statesman and a man thoroughly voice in the government, not only of the various states of the United States, but of the world pretty much as a whole.
Thank you very much. This has been an interview with John M. Young on November 17th, 1971.